Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 348 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Today, we are going to talk about two .22 caliber cartridges designed for use in America's favorite gun in the AR-15 platform, the 223 Remington and the 22 ARC. As always, we'll discuss the overall design characteristics and performance specs of each round, and then we'll compare how they stack up next to each other. I will also cover how they each perform in some ballistic gel tests and discuss some interesting aspects of how they each performed at the range. Before we get started, I am giving away 2 boxes of Barnes Vortex long-range ammo for the 6.5 Creedmoor with their 127 grain LRX bullet. This is a great round for the Creedmoor. Anyone over the age of 21 who is not otherwise prohibited from possessing a firearm and who lives in a state I can ship to is eligible to enter. Sign up at the link in the show notes or thebiggamehuntingblog.com/giveaway, and you will be entered in a random drawing for these 2 boxes. One person will get both boxes. Be sure to confirm your email address if you are asked to do so after you sign up. You have until 11:59 p.m. Central Time on 11 December to sign up. That is next week. I will randomly select one lucky listener from all the submissions on 12 December to receive this ammo. All right, let's get started talking about the 22 ARC and the 223 Remington. We will talk about their history and design differences briefly. Then we'll talk about their performance specs and how they compare to each other. We'll start with the 223 Remington. Now, the U.S. military replaced the M14 rifle and the 7.62 by 51 millimeter cartridge with the M16 and the high-velocity 5.56 by 45 millimeter cartridge in the early 1960s. Folks at Remington liked what they saw with the new 5.56 round, and they standardized a new cartridge with SAAMI as the 223 Remington around that same time. It's important to note that the 5.56 and the 223 are very, very similar, but not completely identical. Now, factory loads for the new 223 Remington could push a 55 grain bullet at nearly 3,300 feet per second, and it quickly caught on with target shooters and varmint hunters. Plus, though you can get it in other rifles, this cartridge was designed from the start to function in the then brand new M16 rifle. The civilian AR-15 platform is now the single most popular rifle model in the U.S. as I record this. Now, as good as the 223 is, though, hunters and shooters have long sought a more powerful cartridge that still fits and functions well in the AR-15. That is easier said than done, and various cartridges have attempted to fill this niche over the years without a lot of success. Now, it's pretty tough to create a new cartridge that fits and functions in an AR-15 that also provides significantly improved performance compared to the 223. This is due to the relatively strict size and pressure restrictions the rifle imposes on cartridges. Now, the 22-250 Remington is a higher performance .22 caliber cartridge that can fling the same weight bullet 400 to 500 feet per second faster than the 223. That is a dramatic improvement in performance, and that's actually a bigger jump in velocity than what you get going from a 30-06 to a 300 Win Mag. The catch is the 22-250 is too large to fit in an AR-15, and achieving that performance out of the AR-15 platform has long been the holy grail sought by ballisticians. The folks at Hornady took a stab at this problem with their new 22 Advanced Rifle cartridge, also known as the 22 ARC. They claim this round delivers 22-250 level performance out of the AR-15. So, did they accomplish that feat? And if so, how did they go about doing it? All right, now let's talk about what these cartridges look like and how they actually perform, and if the 22 ARC lives up to expectations. So first, the 223 and the 22 ARC have the same overall length of 2.26 inches. But designers at Hornady use the 6.5 Grendel as a parent case for the 22 ARC. Now, the 6.5 Grendel uses a fatter case than the 223 Remington. And the 22 ARC has a case head diameter of 0.441 inches versus 0.378 inches for the 223. More on this in a second. Now, the 22 ARC was designed to use really long, heavy, high BC bullets, so it actually also has a little bit shorter case than the 223 Remington. But because it is fatter, it can actually still hold 10 to 15% more powder than the 223. Now, both are 22 caliber centerfire cartridges, both fire bullets of the same diameter, but the 22 ARC was designed from the start to utilize really long, heavy, high BC bullets. For instance, Hornady currently produces 62 grain, 70 grain, 75 grain, 80 grain, and 88 grain factory loads for the 22 ARC. Stuff in the 50 to 77 range is much more common for the 223, especially with factory loads. The 22 ARC has a semi-spec rifling twist rate of 1 in 7 inches. The 223 has a 1 in 12 semi-spec twist rate. But many rifles in 223 or 5.56, especially ARs, have faster 1 in 7, 1 in 8, or 1 in 9 twist rates. Now, head height is the amount of space available for the bullet outside the case while staying within the SAMI specifications for the cartridge. Basically, more head height facilitates the use of really long aerodynamic bullets without requiring them to be seated so deeply into the case they intrude into the powder column. Since both cartridges have the same overall length of 2.26 inches, the 22 ARC actually has more head height, 0.735 inches versus 0.5 inches, than the 223 Remington, since the newer cartridge has a shorter case. Long story short, the 22 ARC can fire those heavier, higher BC bullets faster than the 223 can fire a lighter bullet with a lower BC. Here is an example. Hornady's initial premier factory load for the 22 ARC fired a 62 grain ELD VT bullet with a .395 BC at an advertised velocity of 3,300 feet per second from a 24-inch barrel. I obtained an actual velocity of 3,200 feet per second from my Odin Works upper receiver with an 18-inch barrel. Hornady advertises 3,240 feet per second for the 55 grain VMAX, .255 BC, from a 24-inch barrel in their Varmint Express line. I actually measured a velocity of 2,941 feet per second for that ammo out of my AR with an 18-inch barrel as well. Your mileage may vary, but the 22 ARC fires a bullet with a much higher BC, right, .395 versus .255, about 250 feet per second faster than the 223 in the real world when both are fired from 18-inch barrels. In fact, my 22 ARC was going about as fast out of an 18-inch barrel as Hornady advertises that 55 grain bullet out of a 24-inch barrel. All right, now let's dig into things in more detail, and we'll compare the 62 grain and 75 grain 22 ARC factory loads from Hornady to that 55 grain VMAX I just mentioned, along with a 53 grain VMAX and 75 grain ELD match loads for the 223. Now, the 55 grain VMAX is a run-of-the-mill loading, very typical performance for that specific load. But that 53 grain VMAX is actually about as good as it gets for a high-performance 223 varmint factory load because it has a blistering fast advertised velocity of 3,465 feet per second and a pretty darn high BC of .290. Remember, the 55 grain bullet has a BC of .255. Now, Hornady does not offer the 75 grain ELD match bullet in a factory load for the 223, but they list a maximum velocity of 2,700 feet per second for it in their 10th edition reloading handbook. It is important to note that this bullet is really long and has a specified cartridge overall length of 2.39 inches when loaded in the 223. That is too long to fit in typical 223 or 5.56 rifle magazines. You can make it work with hand loads and usually single loading cartridges at the range. It just takes a little bit more effort. Now, like most companies, Hornady publishes their data for the 22 ARC and the 223 Remington using a 24-inch long barrel. Now, like I just mentioned, I do have that Odin Works 22 ARC upper receiver with an 18-inch long barrel. I also have a Diamondback DB15 in 223 Wild, which also has an 18-inch long barrel. So with that in mind, I will include ballistic data based on both advertised velocities as well as actual velocities with both rifle cartridges shooting those factory ammo. I'll do that for all the loads I just mentioned except the 75 grain 223 load. And I'll do that in order to give you an idea of what sort of performance you can expect from both cartridges under real-world conditions with that shorter 18-inch long barrel, which is pretty common for both cartridges. Now, I observed a drop-off in velocity of about 100 feet per second for both 22 arc loads out of an 18-inch long barrel compared to what Hornady advertises with a 24-inch long barrel. The 223 loads actually saw an even larger drop-off of around 300 to 350 feet per second out of that 18-inch long barrel. With all that in mind, the 62 grain ELDVT has a significant advantage over all the 223 loads, even when comparing the slowest 62 grain load from an 18-inch long barrel to the fastest 223 load from a 24-inch long barrel. That was the 53 grain Superformance load. Those two loads have essentially the same muzzle energy and almost identical amounts of bullet drop downrange, but the 22 ARC has about 19% more retained kinetic energy and nearly 2 inches less wind deflection at 300 yards, and 37% more retained kinetic energy and about 6 inches less wind deflection at 500 yards. And remember, that's based on real-world velocity for the 22 ARC out of an 18-inch long barrel compared to the advertised and probably optimistic performance of the 223 out of a 24-inch long barrel. The difference is even more stark when you compare the 62 grain ELDVT to the slower and lower BC 55 grain VMAX load. Even assuming you're getting the advertised velocity out of the 223, and like I said, it was going nearly 300 feet per second slower than advertised out of my rifle, and even assuming a loss of about 100 feet per second versus advertised performance, like I observed with the 22 ARC, the 22 ARC still has about 10% more muzzle energy, about an inch less bullet drop, and just over 4 inches less wind deflection at 300 yards, and nearly 50% more retained kinetic energy at 300 yards. About 10 inches less bullet drop and over a foot less wind deflection at 500 yards, and nearly 90% more retained energy at 500 yards. So that's a big jump up in performance going from a run-of-the-mill 223 up to the 22 ARC. That 75 grain 223 hand load hangs pretty well with the 62 grain ELDVT in the wind deflection and retained energy departments, but the 22 ARC still beats it pretty handily in both areas when it is shooting a 75 grain bullet too. Additionally, that 75 grain 223 load easily has the most bullet drop out of everything in this comparison because it starts off going so slow due to the much lower powder capacity of the 223. I was getting a velocity nearly 250 feet per second faster for the 22 ARC with the 75 grain ELD match out of an 18-inch long barrel versus the velocity published in the load manual, which was actually for a 20-inch barrel for the 223 with that 75 grain bullet. Now, as you can see, the 223, like all cartridges, also falls off in performance when you shoot it out of a shorter barrel. But I did not notice nearly as big of a drop-off in performance for the 22 ARC out of a shorter barrel as I did for the 223. Like I said, your mileage may vary here, but I'll say, at least in this situation with these rifles, the advantages the 22 ARC has over the 223 become even more apparent out of those shorter barrels, especially in terms of wind deflection and retained kinetic energy. That is especially true for wind deflection. Assuming the same wind conditions, wind deflection is dependent on bullet velocity and BC. However, small changes in ballistic coefficient result in bigger changes in wind deflection than is the case with velocity. Now, the 22 ARC really shines in the wind. That's a key advantage it has when it comes to scoring hits on smaller targets as ranges increase. A 2-inch difference in the point of impact, which is about the advantage the slow 62 grain ELDVT has over the fast 55 grain VMAX at just 200 yards, could easily be the difference between a hit and a miss on something small like a prairie dog, or between a hit to the vitals that drops a coyote in its tracks versus a hit that is not immediately lethal that allows the coyote to escape. Not only do these factors make it easier to hit a target at longer range, but the 22 ARC also simply hits harder. That can also make a big difference in minimizing wounding loss and just quickly killing animals. That was on display during a recent trip to the range where I shot my 22 ARC and 223 out to 500 yards. That was also borne out in some of the ballistic gel tests that I have done with these two rounds as well, and I'll talk more about the gel tests in a minute. Now, it was a pretty windy day at the range when I was doing the side-by-side comparison of both rounds, and I really had to work to hit targets at 400 and 500 yards, even when using that high-performance 53 grain VMAX out of my 223. In fact, I had to hold over a foot off the target into the wind just to barely hit the opposite edge of a big steel plate at 500 yards with that 53 grain VMAX. Even then, it was sometimes difficult to determine whether I hit the target or not because there was simply much less splash when that 223 bullet impacted all the way out there. Things were much different with the 22 ARC. I needed to account for much less wind deflection to hit the target, and my hits were obvious due to the significantly greater visual effects of the bullet impacting. Those little 50 to 55 grain 22 cal varmint bullets aren't very good in the wind at all. This is also an example of why guys will single load really heavy high BC bullets like the 80 grain Sierra Match King at the 600-yard line when using the 223 during service rifle competition as well. Now, shooting steel obviously is not the same as shooting an animal, but that additional retained velocity and energy downrange for the 22 ARC can result in a more devastating wound cavity that is more likely to quickly kill an animal. I have conducted some ballistic gel tests with a few different 22 ARC and 223 factory loads that further illustrate the differences between these cartridges. I'll discuss those results here in a minute. Furthermore, a hand loader making a custom load for use in a bolt-action rifle can further enhance the performance of the 22 ARC. Now, the 22 ARC has a SAMI max average pressure of 52,000 psi to make it compatible with the AR-15. Factory ammo for the 22 ARC operates within those specs. But Hornady has published higher pressure load data for the cartridge for use in bolt-action rifles. When loaded to 62,000 psi and fired from a bolt-action rifle with a 24-inch long barrel, the 22 ARC is capable of pushing that same 62 grain ELDVT at velocities in excess of 3,500 feet per second, or about 200 feet per second faster than what they advertise for the cartridge out of a 24-inch long barrel out of a gas gun with their factory ammo. That blows even that really high BC, high velocity, 53 grain VMAX load out of the water in the trajectory, kinetic energy, and especially wind deflection departments as that range increases. Now let's talk about recoil briefly. Neither one recoils very much, but the 22 ARC does have more recoil than the 223. Depending on the load, we're talking between, say, 20 and 70% more free recoil energy. Now, sure, it recoils more, but to be perfectly honest, when you're adding 70% to the 223 Remington recoil, it's starting off at such a low number anyway that recoil is still very mild, even at the upper end of what you'll get with a 22 ARC. And to be perfectly honest, both cartridges have an exceptionally mild recoil. Virtually any person should be able to handle them with ease. And that has been my experience shooting both rounds at the range side by side. All right, what about accuracy? Now, ballistic performance on paper, though not unimportant, does not mean a darn thing if you can't hit your target. John Snow wrote a fantastic article on this subject for Outdoor Life. I suggest reading it for more details. Long story short, though, companies designing new cartridges these days typically employ cartridge design principles, incorporating best practices obtained from competition and bench rest shooters to obtain the best possible accuracy. I won't go into excruciating detail here, but the 22 ARC has a design that incorporates just about all of those principles. It has a chamber geometry along the lines of Hornady's successful and highly regarded for accuracy 6.5 Creedmoor and precision rifle cartridge lines. It also has a steeper 30-degree shoulder for head spacing, a fast 1 and 7-inch SAMI spec twist rate, and it has a long enough case neck and ample head height to use those long, heavy, high BC bullets I keep talking about. Taken together, all of those factors result in excellent accuracy potential for the .22 ARC with factory ammo and off-the-shelf rifles, especially with long, heavy, high BC bullets. Both cartridges are certainly capable of excellent accuracy, but I have to give the advantage to the .22 ARC here. Details vary on the exact ammo, rifle, and shooter in question, and yes, there will be occasional instances of .223 rifles shooting better than .22 ARC rifles. And yes, users can work around some of those problems to a certain degree with a custom .223 Remington rifle, special magazines, hand loads designed to accommodate those higher BC bullets and fire them with a high degree of accuracy, etc., etc. Or they can just skip all that hassle and just get a .22 ARC factory rifle, which I think has probably some of the best potential for accuracy available today with factory rifles and ammo out of all widely available .22 caliber centerfires. Now, speaking of factory ammo, this is an area where the .223 has a massive advantage in terms of sheer variety, availability, and price. It is easily one of the most popular centerfire rifle cartridges in the world. And I do not foresee that changing anytime soon. Everybody makes ammo for it, and that stuff is both widely available and inexpensive. On the other hand, Hornady is the only company manufacturing .22 ARC factory ammo at this instant. Now, they currently offer 5 factory loads for the cartridge, an offering in their V-Match line with the 62-grain ELD-VT bullet, an offering in their Superformance line with a 70-grain CX bullet, an offering in their Black line with a 75-grain ELD Match bullet, an offering in their Precision Hunter line with an 80-grain ELD-X bullet, and an offering in their Match line with an 88-grain ELD Match bullet. Ammo prospects for the .22 ARC will likely improve, but it will probably never catch the .223 or the 5.56 in terms of sheer availability. Now, the .223 also handily beats the .22 ARC in terms of rifle availability. Both cartridges are available in bolt-action and semi-auto rifles. Now, while very few AR-15s are actually chambered in .223 Remington, there is a massive selection of ARs in either 5.56 NATO or .223 Wild, both of which can safely shoot .223 and 5.56 ammo. This family of closely related cartridges is easily the most popular chambering for AR-15 style rifles in the world. In fact, if somebody tells you they have an AR, odds are it's either a .223 Wild or a 5.56 NATO, unless they specifically say otherwise. Now, how many different companies produce ARs in those chamberings? To paraphrase Elizabeth Barrett Browning, let me count the ways. Just about any company you can think of that makes ARs makes them in .223 Wild and or 5.56 NATO. Ruger also offers the round in their semi-auto Mini 14 rifle. The .223 is also pretty common in bolt-action rifles, and once again, almost any rifle you can think of is available in that cartridge. You can even get lever-action rifles in .223, like the Browning lever-action rifle and the Henry Long Ranger. Now let's switch gears and talk about the .22 ARC. Now, Hornady usually does a great job of getting rifle makers to pick up their new cartridges when they release them. Well, even though the cartridge is only about a year old as I record this, a bunch of companies already produce a mix of semi-auto and bolt-action .22 ARC rifles like Aero Precision, Christensen Arms, CMMG, Faxon, GA Precision, Howa, HS Precision, Kelby's, Odinworks, Proof Research, Ruger, and Seekins Precision, among other companies. There's not quite as wide of a selection of .22 ARC rifles right now as there is for the .223, but there's actually still a surprisingly good mix of rifles available at various price points. For instance, Ruger offers the cartridge in their Ruger American Generation 2 line. That's great for a lower-priced bolt-action .22 ARC. If you want something more expensive, you can get, say, the Proof Research Elevation MTR 2.0. That's a very nice rifle, but is also much more expensive. And of course, you can get the rifle in the AR-15 platform too. You can either purchase a complete 22 ARC AR-15 or buy a 22 ARC upper receiver from one of several different companies to mate with a lower receiver you already own. If you go that route, you can use regular 6.5 Grendel magazines. That's actually what I do. I have a 22 ARC complete upper receiver from Odinworks. They make uppers with either a 16.1, 18, or 21 inch long barrel. Like I said, mine's 18. I mated it with a SIG lower receiver I already had in 5.56. Well, it came with a 5.56 upper, so I just put that SIG lower receiver on my Odinworks upper, paired it with the 6.5 Grendel magazine, and it's good to go. That rifle shoots really well. Now, Odinworks is not the only company that makes AR-15s in 22 ARC. You can get one, for instance, from Faxon, Rise Armament, and CMMG, or you can build your own with components from a company like Aero Precision, and that's not a complete list, and it's also growing, it seems like, every month. Now, remember what I mentioned earlier about twist rates for these cartridges. 223 Remington rifles are available with several different twist rates. For instance, some of the older bolt-action 223 Remington rifles and current production BLR rifles often have a 1 in 12 inch twist rate in accordance with SAAMI specs. However, faster 1 in 8 inch twist rates are much more common otherwise with current production bolt-action rifles, right? Winchester XPR, Ruger American, Browning X-Bolt all use a 1 in 8 inch twist rate. The Ruger Mini 14 uses a 1 in 9 inch twist rate. Most ARs either have a 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 inch twist rate. Both of mine, 1 in 5.56, 1 in 223 Wild, have a 1 in 7 inch twist rate. On the other hand, 22 ARC rifles are almost exclusively produced with a 1 in 7 inch twist rate. Okay, so with all that said, which one is right for you? Well, are you looking for a good all-around varmint or predator hunting cartridge? Both are excellent cartridges for hunting animals like coyotes and prairie dogs. Which one is best in those situations depends. Now, the 22 ARC has a flatter trajectory, performs better in windy conditions, and it carries a lot more energy out to extended range. So it has a definite advantage on a more open country hunt. I also think it is a little bit better for use just on bigger varmints like coyotes as opposed to, say, prairie dogs. In fact, I think the 22 ARC is the almost perfect cartridge for coyote hunting. That is especially true for hunters pursuing coyotes at night with a thermal sight and or in really windy conditions. Now, obtaining an accurate range is very difficult at night, but the flat shooting and wind bucking characteristics of the round that are significantly better than the 223 really come in handy under those conditions. Plus, the fact that it is a low recoil cartridge designed for use in an AR-15 instead of being primarily restricted to a bolt action like the 22-250 also facilitates rapid follow-up shots. Those characteristics make it easier to place shots more accurately on coyotes, but the 22 ARC is also more likely to anchor a coyote with even a less than perfect shot, since it just hits with more authority and it uses that devastating ELD VT bullet. It works great at shorter range, but the 22 advanced rifle cartridge really comes into its own in open country where longer shots are a possibility, and a solid hit, and possibly even a less than perfect hit, with the 22 ARC will often put a coyote down for good. I've shot several different 223 and 22 ARC loads into ballistic gel. On the varmint hunting front, I've tested 53 grain VMAX and 62 grain ELD VT bullets for each cartridge. The 62 grain ELD VT produced a wider and longer wound track that can potentially pay some important dividends with less than ideal shot placement. The same is also true for a shot on an animal running directly away from the shooter or very strongly quartering away from the shooter. Now, while a hit, say for instance, from a 53 grain VMAX from a 223 will still likely cripple the animal if it does not kill it outright with that shot angle, the deeper overall penetration and longer wound cavity of the 62 grain ELD VT is more likely to cause devastating damage to the vitals of that animal and thus kill it faster. On the downside, I can certainly see the 22 ARC as being rougher on fur than the 223. So if your goal is to quickly kill a predator and minimize wounding loss, like during a coyote hunting contest, then the 22 ARC is the round for you. I would be hesitant to use it if I were trying to sell the furs of those animals afterwards. None of this is to say the 223 isn't capable of cleanly killing coyotes. On the contrary, it can be extremely effective in that role, and with the right ammunition and rifle setup, like a bolt-action rifle with a 24-inch long barrel shooting spicy hand loads, or the Hornady Superformance ammo with that 53-grain VMAX, it actually still does pretty darn well at extended range. The downside of going that route is you must use a bolt-action rifle and have a rifle with a longer barrel to squeeze out that extra performance instead of a semi-auto like you can with the 22 ARC. But what if you're hunting under conditions where you're just unlikely to take a longer shot? Though the 22 ARC is more powerful at all ranges, the 223 is still a very flat shooting cartridge itself, and it does not require much holdover or much wind hold inside 300 yards. If you're hunting in thicker country and shots farther than that are uncommon, then you're really not giving up too much performance if you go with the 223 instead of the 22 ARC. Yeah, the 22 ARC is still more powerful, but I don't think it makes that much difference whether you shoot a coyote at 85 yards with a good varmint bullet out of either one. You put that bullet close to where it needs to go, and it's going to be a dead dog. Don't forget about the massive advantages the 223 Remington has in terms of ammo and rifle availability, reliability, and cost either. As the saying goes, amateurs study tactics and professionals study logistics. Well, the 223 Remington blows the 22 ARC out of the water in the logistical arena, while at the same time it is also more than good enough for use in many coyote hunting situations. So yeah, the 22 ARC is definitely better in some situations, but the question is it enough better for the situation that you are more likely to be using it in to justify the downsides associated with rifle and ammunition availability? The same is also true with the fact that just everything associated with the 22 ARC costs a little more than the 223 Remington. But what if you want a cartridge ideal for hunting big game, like feral hogs, deer? So first, beware that 22 caliber cartridges are not legal for big game hunting everywhere, but assuming they are where you're going to be hunting, there are pros and cons to each one. On one hand, there is a much bigger supply of 223 factory ammo suitable for big game hunting than is the case with the 22 ARC. Now, that cartridge also has a proven track record on big game too. I personally have never killed a bigger animal with it, but plenty of people have used the 223 on stuff like deer, hogs, and even bigger creatures with good results. Now, I have shot 64-grain PowerPoint, 55-grain CX, and 62-grain Fusion loads for the 223 into gel. The PowerPoint and Fusion loads did not penetrate that well either. But I will say the 55-grain CX performed much better in that area. Now, the 22 ARC can provide improved performance in this area, but your ammo choice matters a lot. That V-Match 22 ARC load is wonderful for stuff like coyotes, foxes, that sort of thing, but I don't advise using it on big game. In fact, I have heard stories of terrible penetration from coyote hunters who encountered a hog by happenstance and then shot it with a 62-grain ELD VT they had in the chamber. Hornady does not recommend using either ELD match bullet for big game hunting, but that doesn't necessarily mean it won't work. In fact, Tyler Friel at Outdoor Life killed a nice bull moose in Alaska with his 22 ARC using the 88-grain ELD match in 2024. Of the two match loads I've tested in gel, the 88-grain bullet did penetrate much better than the 75-grain bullet. So his results weren't exactly shocking, and he did use the bullet I would use in that role if you made me choose one of the 3 factory loads available at the time for the 22 ARC to hunt a moose with. But Hornady does make that ELD-X factory load for the 22 ARC now. That load was not available at the time of Tyler's moose hunt, but it is now, and I personally think that bullet is a better choice for hunting big game than the 75 or 88 grain ELD match bullets. Zach May from Reloading Quest recently killed several animals in Africa, like impala and blesbok, with that 80-grain ELDX bullet from a 22 ARC, and it did great. That bullet actually delivered a wider wound track and better penetration in gel for me than the 88-grain ELD match did. Now, Hornady advertises 3,010 feet per second for the 80-grain ELDX from a 24-inch barrel in the 22 ARC. Plan on it doing something in the 28 to 2,900 foot per second range from an 18-inch long barrel, and that is in between the velocities I obtained with the 75-grain and 88-grain ELD match loads. And that's pretty darn impressive performance for a really heavy hunting bullet like that out of a 22 caliber cartridge in an AR-15. Now, with that 80-grain ELDX or the new 70-grain CX load, I think the 22 ARC is a more capable choice for big game than the 223 as well. In fact, I am planning on using the 22 ARC with that 80-grain ELDX load for some nighttime hog control work. I have all the gear, I just need the hogs to cooperate, but I will be sure to let you know how that goes as well. I have not killed anything with the 22 ARC yet, but that 80-grain ELDX is the exact same projectile used in Hornady's 22 Creedmoor factory loads. It's just going a couple hundred feet per second slower from the 22 ARC. I have killed a couple of hogs and deer with that round, and the results were impressive. Since it's the same bullet, just going a little bit slower at the muzzle, it will perform very similar out of the 22 ARC to how the faster 22 Creedmoor will at a longer range. Though you certainly could use the 22 ARC on a bigger creature like an elk or a moose, like Tyler did, and he said that his 22 ARC killed that moose just about as effectively as all the other bigger rounds that he has used on moose in the past. That said, I personally think the 22 ARC is best in that deer, hog, small antelope range. It will work great in that role with the appropriate bullets, and I would readily choose it over the 223. All right, so that is the long and short of it with the 223 and the 22 ARC. There are some significant differences between them in some respects, but both are highly capable Predator and Varmint cartridges that can also make the jump up to bigger game with the right ammunition, etc. I think there are definitely situations where the 22 ARC makes a lot more sense for someone to use instead of the 223, but there's also a lot of situations, like I talked about, where the 223 is still a great choice and the juice may not be worth the squeeze to use the 22 ARC over the 223 in those certain situations. So really, you just got to look at this, analyze the situation, the conditions you're going to be using it under, and make an appropriate choice. The 22 ARC is a well-designed modern round that has a lot going for it, but don't count the 223 Remington out either. I have and like both, and I will probably continue to use both going forward. As usual, I have written a detailed article about these cartridges for the Big Game Hunting blog. I will put a link to that article in the show notes if you want to check it out. The same is also true for other things like hearing protection, sling scopes, all that. So check out those URLs to learn more. Don't forget to sign up for my ammo giveaway at the link in the show notes or by going to thebiggamehuntingblog.com/giveaway. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.